Let's get some facts straight about the British Heavy Cavalry Officer's Sword. So welcome to the channel. I'm Matt Easton of Schola Gladiatoria and Easton Antique Arms. If you're not subscribed, please click that subscribe button below. Now, I've noticed there are quite a lot of misconceptions, just basically wrong information floating around on the internet, mostly which goes back to older books, which are still very good knowledge base for us, talking about British military swords of the Georgian, Victorian and Edwardian eras, and later in fact. And some of the information has been superseded, it's now a bit outdated, but it's still floating around on the internet, and it leads to lots of misunderstanding and confusion, in fact. Now, the main fact that I want to lead with and point out is that there is no 1887 pattern British Heavy Cavalry Officer's Sword. Let me repeat that. There is no 1887 pattern, okay? So in British Heavy Cavalry Swords for officers, we go from the 1796, then we go to the 1821 Heavy Cavalry Officer's Sword with a pipe-back blade. Then in 1845 it gets a new type of blade, the new Wilkinson type of blade, so it becomes essentially, it's still the 1821 Heavy Cavalry Officer's hilt, but with a new updated blade. We'll look at examples in a minute. And then the next update is not until 1896, and in 1896 the Heavy Cavalry Officer's Sword becomes the Universal Cavalry Officer's Sword. So for light cavalry and heavy cavalry, they all adopt the same pattern, but it's based on the earlier Heavy Cavalry Officer's Sword, but with one major change, and we'll look at that in a second as well. And then the sword doesn't change again until 1912, when there's quite a revolutionary change in sword design, which we're not going to look at in this video, but I have dealt with in previous videos. If you're interested in the 1908 and the 1912 pattern, then do have a search for it. If you're interested in the 1908 and 1912 pattern cavalry officer swords, then search in my videos and you'll find some videos about them there. So for the purposes of this video, the story that we're going to look at here starts in 1796 with the adoption of this Heavy Cavalry Officer's Sword, which is a more elaborate and detailed sword than the trooper's sword. So for anyone who doesn't realise, a cavalryman is known as a trooper. There were heavy cavalry and light cavalry regiments. I've spoken about those in previous videos, so I'm not going to go into detail on that here. The heavy cavalry were numerically less, fewer than the light cavalry. So most cavalry regiments were light cavalry. All of the yeomanry cavalry, who are essentially volunteers, part-time soldiers, they're all light cavalry, and only a few select regiments are classed as heavy cavalry. So heavy cavalry officers' swords, not obviously officers are less numerous than their men, than the troopers, so heavy cavalry officers' swords are not hugely common, because at any one given time there were never a huge number of heavy cavalry officers, because there weren't many heavy cavalry regiments, and there were maybe only 30 officers in each regiment. But this is the 1796 Heavy Cavalry Officer's Sword. We're not going to look particularly at this sword in this video. I'm going to focus more on the Victorian swords, but I want you to notice the design of the hilt, and it has this scrolling sort of sometimes known as a ladder hilt actually, but it has this sort of floral decoration of the hilt. Now when the grab an example here. So this is a mid-Victorian sword from about 1850. And when this model of sword came in, it in 1821 initially with this hilt, ignore the blade because the blade is the post-1845 type, but this type of hilt is very clearly inspired by the earlier Napoleonic era 1796 Heavy Cavalry Officer's hilt. So there was a continuity of design, and in fact this style of guard specifically, so a hilt refers to the whole handle section, the grip, the back strap and the guard, but the guard specifically remained almost unchanged for heavy cavalry officers all the way through to 1912, and in fact when it was replaced in 1912 with a big bowl hilt that is copied based on the 1908 trooper's sword, that does have decoration on it, which is again harking back to the decoration we find here, which goes all the way back to 1796. So this type of guard has a continuity that goes right the way through the period we're looking at here, and that type of guard came in 1821, okay, and stayed all the way through to 1912. Now, what's notable about this hilt, again, we're not going to look at blades particularly here, we're going to focus on the hilts, because this is the easy way to identify the patterns and to prove that there is no 1887 pattern. Characteristically, we've got a fairly curved backstrap here. We have you might not be able to see, unfortunately, but the pommel is checkered, okay? If I grab another example I've got down here, you'll be able to see on this example, it's a little bit clearer. You can see the pommel is checkered. But to confuse matters, the pommels on them are not always checkered. And here's another Victorian example. So same guard, but you'll notice this has what's called a stepped pommel. Okay, so it's like it sounds, it's stepped instead of checkered. So a lot of them were checkered, but not all of them. Some of them are stepped. But you'll notice that the back strap is slightly curving, mostly smooth, but we do have a checkered section here for the thumb, so that when you're holding it with the thumb up, it's a little bit more secure. The thumbs are slightly to slide off. The thumb was put up by some people to cut and to thrust, and by some people just to thrust, but nevertheless, sometimes the thumb's put up and you want a more secure thumb placer, index, and that's what that checkered region is for. Incidentally, we don't really know why the pommels were checkered. There's much debate about that. But that guard basically stayed, as I say, from 1821 all the way through to 1912. Now, the next change, and I just grabbed this other Victorian example here. So these are of a similar era. They both date to about 1850, 55. This example made by Benjamin Thurkel. This example made by Henry Wilkinson. This one, incidentally, was carried almost certainly in the Indian Mutiny. This one, unfortunately, I don't know who carried it or who owned it. Again, we won't talk about the blades here. This actually has a non-regulation blade on it, so it's quite unusual. This has the regulation Henry Wilkinson 1845 pattern blade. If you look on Easton Antique Arms under the resources section, you will find essays about these, incidentally, if you want to learn more about the blade types. But they fundamentally, this is the model 1821 heavy cavalry officer's hilt. The same guard design with the same circular floral scrolling decoration, the same curved-ish backstrap, rounded backstrap, this one with a stepped pommel, this one with a checkered pommel, this one has a checkered thumb placer, this one is smooth. Generally speaking, the earlier ones are completely smooth on the back, and then it became more and more popular to have a checkered section down here on the backstrap, such that by the 1880s, when this Wilkinson example dates from, the backstrap has actually changed shape slightly. So here we've got the checkered pommel as before. There's still a very slight curve to the backstrap, but you'll notice the backstrap has become straighter. The guard is exactly the same design, so the guard hasn't changed. The backstrap becomes straighter, and this is, some people like to think that straighter backstraps always indicate a later sword. My observation is that whilst there is a tendency and a preference for the backstraps to get straighter, particularly in the 1880s and definitely into the 1890s, but we'll talk about the 1890s in a minute, that's not always universal. You do find earlier examples with straighter backstraps, and you do find later examples from the 1880s with curved backstraps. So it's only tendencies, it's not a rule. But very, very important detail to note here. This sword is from the 1880s, and note it is only checkered where the thumb placer goes. This part of the backstrap is smooth. This part of the backstrap has a rounded section and has a checkered thumb placer only. It's not fully checkered all the way up the back. Now, so what about this fictional 1887 pattern? Well, it isn't an 1887 pattern. Where the confusion lies is that in 1896, all cavalry, whether they were light or heavy, the officers adopted one model of sword which was based on the earlier heavy cavalry officer's sword, like this. It was based on this, but with one important difference. And that important difference actually relates to the year 1895. And in 1895, a new model of infantry officer's sword was introduced. And that new model of infantry officer's sword had a new steel hilt, completely new type of guard, and very critically, a new backstrap. And that new backstrap was straight and fully checkered. Not only was it straight and fully checkered, but where you put the thumb here has a squared section. So instead of being rounded, if we look around here, it's rounded in that direction. It's now flat and straight. That gives a much better index for the thumb. The thumb's less likely to slip off. It's just much better, a greater amount of friction essentially. So in 1896, when the Universal Cavalry Officer's Sword pattern was introduced, the 1896 pattern, not 87 pattern, that had the 1895 backstrap. And no sword could have had that backstrap before 1895, not with all of those features anyway, because that was a new 1895 pattern backstrap. So that's why cavalry swords that were introduced in 1896 onwards have that new type of backstrap, because that was the new, freshest thing on the block. And here I have an example, another example by Wilkinson. This actually happens to be a patent solid hilt, which means it has a full width tang, but ignore that factor. And this, you will notice, if I pick up the earlier Victorian one, whilst this is dark from patina and the other one's shiny because it's plated, they are the same style of guard. Okay, so it's the same, exactly the same style of guard that's been around since 1821. But the back straps are entirely different. First of all, you'll notice that the newer 1896 one is usually slightly longer. They did actually come in different lengths, and the officer purchased their own sword so they could choose basically whatever details they wanted. But usually they are longer. But you'll notice the back strap has a very, very different shape. It is now, let's put the partially checkered one down. You will hopefully be able to see that this back strap is completely checkered all the way down, and down here we've got a square section. Can you see it's very rectangular and flat, even with little raised edges there? This is a completely blocky rectangular section, and the whole back strap is checkered, and the pommel's still checkered as well. This is the 1896 pattern. There is no 1887 pattern. 1887 pattern is basically from ignorance. It's from a lack of knowledge base. It's from a lack of data. It's from research which goes back to thinking about the 1960s or 70s, when they didn't have access to as many records as we have now, and they thought that there was an 1887 pattern. There is no 1887 pattern. There is an 1821 pattern heavy cavalry officer's sword with either the pipe back blade, the 1821 pipe back blade, or the 1845 Wilkinson blade after 1845, which is what you mostly encounter, like this, the fullard blade. So this is essentially an 1821 pattern heavy cavalry officer's hilt with an 1845 pattern blade, okay? And that stayed in use until 1896. And in 1896, all cavalry officers, whether they were light or heavy, got this sword, or purchased this sword with the 1895 backstrap. So, heavy cavalry officer's sword, we've got 1796 pattern, 1821 pattern with a pipe back blade, 1821 pattern with the 1845 pattern blade, the fullard blade, and then all the way up to 1896. In 1896 you get this for all cavalry officers, and then in 1912 completely different type of sword. So there we go. I hope that helps clarify, and I hope that makes things a little bit clearer. Please stop referring to 1887 pattern swords, or if you genuinely think that there is an 1887 pattern, then I'm very happy to see the evidence for it. But so far, every sword I've seen labelled as an 1887 pattern sword has had an 1895 pattern backstrap. And if you think about that for a second, that's not possible, because that backstrap didn't come out until 1895. So how could an 1887 pattern sword have a guard from 8 years later? I don't see how that can happen. But anyway, there we go. So 1896 pattern, not 1887 pattern. I hope this has been interesting. Remember to subscribe and click the notification bell if you haven't done already. Give us a like. Share the video around, and I'll see you again on Schola Gladiatoria channel for another video. And remember to check out the articles I've written and put up on the Easton Antique Arms page, because if you're interested in this stuff, you'll definitely be interested in some of those as well. Cheers for watching, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.